Salesforce has long been recognized as one of Silicon Valley's most innovative tech companies, and one of its largest. Employing some 50,000 people around the world, the company is a cloud software service provider, specializing in customer relationship management services, which doesn't sound particularly aligned to social impact issues, but in fact, Salesforce has always promoted the idea of business as a tool for change, not simply a means for enriching shareholders. Salesforce.org is the social impact center of the company, using the Salesforce tech software products to help serve vulnerable populations, as well as using Salesforce employees to help drive social impact projects. Well, recently I spoke to Samira Khan, who is the Senior Manager of Global Impact Engagement at Salesforce.org, about the company's philanthropic work. Samira, first of all, thanks very much indeed for talking to me.
Thanks for having me.
Your annual report on issues of social impact for 2020, in paragraph 2, the CEO states quite plainly that technology, when used for social impact, can change the world, which is an inspiring thought, and indeed is something that Salesforce, and the kind of sentiment that Salesforce often expresses. But just explain to me a little bit what that means and how you plan to change the world.
Sure. Just to clarify a bit, so the report that you're looking at is actually put out by Salesforce.org. And so Salesforce.com has their own stakeholder impact report that covers the entire brand and all of its impact. So this report specifically refers to the work that's coming out of .org, which is a social impact center of Salesforce. And what
Sorry to interrupt you. I mean, that's a really good distinction to make, because there are a couple of other tech companies I know that similarly have a .org and a .com. And I'd like to know why that structure exists, what it means in terms of Salesforce, what that organizational structure is set up to achieve.
Absolutely. But let me go back to your question, because I think it's a very important question about technology and using technology for good and to change the world. So at .org, we do that in a couple of different ways. One, we offer our product, which is, as you know, a CRM, a customer/constituent relationship management platform that gives a 360 view. We offer it for a discounted rate or for free to specific nonprofits through our Power of Us Hub program. So in offering it for free, that's sort of a business model innovation. We are empowering them and enabling them with tech tools they otherwise wouldn't have access to. In addition to that, we do help support them in a pro bono capacity with our employees. Again, I'm referring to just a subset of some of the work that .org does. There's more being done, by .com, and we like to view ourselves as partners in innovation with our community using our platform. So just to sort of clarify, and as far as the structure, that's a great question. It does come up a lot. So originally we were part of .com, and then we broke off as a separate social enterprise, and now again we're part of .com as of July 2019. And I would say the main thing I want to highlight about that difference is the business model. So obviously it was different to be a social enterprise, and it's different to be a business unit in a company. There are various benefits that come along with joining the brand and becoming a business unit, as well as another sort of social impact center at .com, which is what we are now.
I asked the question, and let me put it to you in a bold way. I asked the question because a lot of companies will put their social enterprise activities, their ESG activities, their declarations to making a social impact and doing good in an environmental and in a social way, they'll put it in the PR or in the marketing department, and they will use it as a means of painting themselves as environmentally friendly without actually really committing to it in the business sense and at the bottom line. So it's always, as you know, I mean, it's a fairly contentious area in some senses. So just explain to me how the philosophy of the company approaches those issues.
So Mark Benioff often says that our purpose is to use business as a platform for change. I think that change refers to societal change more broadly, and a huge portion of it actually pertains to impact in our communities and social impact. So if you think about that as our purpose, then what we're doing at .org is merely a part of us living out our purpose, which means it's core and it's central to our business. So I do not view it as, and nor is it, a part of marketing or a marketing play. It is very much a part of our DNA, a part of our culture, and a part of our purpose, not just in terms of messaging, but as I mentioned, we are a social impact center. And then in addition to that, there's an impact investment fund that sits under Salesforce Ventures. There's a strong office of equality that works in partnership with others. There's an entire sort of unit dedicated to global philanthropy and engagement that's doing strategic grant giving and education and workforce development. So as far as I'm concerned, Mark Benioff is truly trying to bring together the various assets that the company has and bring them to bear on social impact at large, keeping in mind our various stakeholders, our employees, our customers, our partners. It's not an easy thing to do, but I guess I'll flip the question back to you. If we're not doing it well, then who's doing it well?
I never said you weren't doing it well, Samira. Not for one moment. Please forgive me if that was the impression. But like I say, it's just one of those conversations that is consistently out there and needs to be articulated. Otherwise, if you don't make that explicit, a lot of people will begin to assume that, perhaps assume the worst in some circumstances. So I'm glad you clarified that situation. And it's interesting the way you've laid it out, insofar as there seems to be so many aspects to the whole process, and it's a pretty well thought through philosophy at the company, if you like. So just tell me about your role. I mean, tell me how you're driving forward that message through the context of your own position.
Thanks, Tamora. I'm actually glad that you went there, because I think a very important piece of bringing impact to life and making sure that it's real and holding stakeholders accountable is impact measurement and management. So I'm currently on the Salesforce.org team that is squarely focused on impact management. We're called the Global Impact Engagement Team. So the report to which you're referring came out a few years back. It came out of my team's work around measurement and evaluation. And so our first goal was to walk the walk, was to go out and articulate and quantify our own social impact as Salesforce.org. Now, the next iteration is that how do we use our technology, our people, to set an example and to enable our customers and our partners to do similarly. So that's really this notion of putting some structure and accountability around it. And we work a lot with sort of standard setters and metrics and sort of thinking about these things from a thought leadership perspective. So I think that kind of leads. My work is across that team. And in addition to that, one thing I've been recently involved with is how can Salesforce better support social entrepreneurs? As you can imagine, given the pandemic, social enterprises are very much struggling, first and foremost with cash and liquidity issues, secondly, just with capacity, and some can't even see their lifeline beyond, say, 6 months and a year. So we're doing some thinking and work around that as well.
Interesting that you talk about social entrepreneurs and the difficulties they have. I mean, one of the difficulties comes back in a way to what we're talking about, and that is the DNA of a company which stresses that it does have a different perspective on stakeholders and the duty to stakeholders as opposed to shareholders. And so many small social enterprises can't seem to raise money because business still views their proposals in financial terms alone rather than in broader stakeholder terms. And it's fascinating that Salesforce has grown so large in managing to maintain that big stakeholder-wide perspective. What kind of advice do you give social enterprises as to how they can manage their business, their bottom line financials, and their growth potential whilst maintaining their focus on their social enterprise status and their stakeholders?
Now, that's a great question. So any sort of advice that I'm giving it from my personal perspective. And Tamor, the reason I took this sort of opportunity is because I know that you've done some work in Asia, and I'm very inclined toward sort of expanding our footprint even further into Asia. And I think some of the social enterprises there are the most forward-leaning in terms of impact on the ground, how in touch they are with communities, last-mile solutions and innovations, and the types of problems they're solving are very different. So I've done a lot of volunteering on the ground, through the wonderful volunteer time off program that Salesforce offers, but also on my own personal sort of time. And so I've seen it up front. And I would say first and foremost is just to keep things very simple, to really focus on what is the business challenge you're trying to solve, and to not adopt, let's say, technology for the sake of adopting technology, to really try to figure out which stage of maturity you're at and then engage with technology or any other sort of pursuit in that way. So oftentimes I will have social enterprises coming to me wanting to use Salesforce. Of course, that is wonderful. I work at Salesforce. However, the next question is, how do you plan to use it? Do you have somebody there who's going to get up to speed and who's going to maintain it? So truly sort of getting an understanding of what they're trying to do and then putting them in touch with the right people internally, because I do think there are different personas and prototypes. There are those who are very early stage, there are those who are more mature and who have developed good relationships with funders. There are others who have not. It really depends on the geography. So something that came up in a recent webinar was this concept of, I guess it's not new, glocal, or being more community focused or local. I think there's something to be said about strong relationships in the community. So I would advise all social enterprises to develop those relationships with those that have global reach, with their funders, etc., and to spend time on that, even if it doesn't pay dividends immediately. Because when something like a pandemic happens, you're immediately going to go to your network to help you get the cash, the resources, the capabilities. So there's something around partnership, but there's no easy answer. I mean, when you're struggling just to maintain your business, thinking about partnerships is sort of second order and third order. I do admit that.
I want to talk specifically about some of the social enterprises that you are engaged in and the nitty-gritty of your work. But one final quick question on that general broad picture, again relating to the idea of how a company views its responsibility to broader stakeholder groups. And I wonder whether you're finding at Salesforce that as a business proposition, a stronger commitment to ESG, a stronger commitment to broader stakeholder identification is helping the company as a whole. Are you finding that employees are responding to that social message? Are you finding that the business world in general is heading in this direction more, and it's becoming a business positive to have that kind of attitude?
I absolutely think it's a business positive. There are key academics who are trying to actually look at sort of employee engagement from a business performance perspective. They are trying to look at ESG reporting and those that have done well on ESG metrics and how they are performing as a business. So there have already been some sort of studies and correlations that have emerged in general in the academic space that are out there. And in addition to that, I can say the reason I am at Salesforce is this sort of culture around social impact, the fact that I can, have good on society and connect with like-minded people to organize around social causes while doing my day-to-day job. Granted, I'm put together that way, but you'll see an increasing number of millennials who are put together that way. So I think it enables us to recruit better talent. It changes the way in which we work together. It changes the nature of our innovations. They tend to have more of a social impact angle, I would argue, or that's always sort of in mind. It also changes our relationships with our communities and allows us as a corporation to sustain ourselves in a different way.
Now, let's get to the nitty-gritty then.
Okay.
I know that you have lived in various parts of the world. You have a connection with Asia through your work and other ways. Tell me a little bit about some specific examples of your interaction with social enterprises and how you encourage them and how Salesforce can help them, and specifically where there are social enterprises, how can they engage with Salesforce?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So more recently, meaning Salesforce.org, has joined the World Economic COVID Alliance for Social Entrepreneurs. This is a space where various organizations, intermediaries, capacity development providers, private companies have come together, impact investors have come together and said what they will commit to or put on the table to support social enterprises. And what we have done is we have said that this Power of Us Hub program will be available to the intermediaries and their portfolios. So I'm kind of trying to fast track their access to technology. There's also this notion of fast tracking their access to pro bono or employee support. So I'm working closely on that aspect. And there's also an element of what else we can bring to the table in partnership with others. So I've had conversations conversations with Ashoka on how we can learn from one another. Let's see where those go. But there are other organizations we've supported in the past, and now we're supporting them even more. I've had, Acumen Fund is a client of ours or a customer of ours. So I'm also sort of speaking to them and trying to get a sense of what the needs are on the ground of portfolio organizations. So it's very much with a focus on technology as well as pro bono support. And obviously, there's also an element of funding. There's a number of organizations that are working on funding. But as I mentioned to you, Salesforce is very large. So I'm working on a sliver of it. I do think there is something there. One thing I would like to highlight is simply the fact that oftentimes social enterprises don't have the same tax status as a nonprofit. So we have been I think that's been a bit of a barrier, and it's not just with us, it's with a lot of organizations. Like, how do they carve out a space? Because I think the lines are blurring between pure nonprofits and sort of social enterprises or impact startups. So I do think there need to be some structural or policy changes or external changes, and we need to interact in a certain way with the space that opens up the doors even more. But that's where we are. I hope that answers your question.
Well, it's an interesting point, the tax question, because it's relevant all over the world, and of course it's subject to particular jurisdictions in the particular countries that you operate in. Is there a high level conversation that is going on between those corporations like Salesforce and their partners and governments as to what the future might look like in this context? How does that conversation begin?
To be very honest, I'm not familiar with the conversation sort of at the government level. Many years ago, I did read sort of thought leadership around this, that there needs to be a change, X, Y, Z. Obviously, you've heard of sort of B corporations, benefit corporations. So that's sort of a designation. I think there are certain legal designations that corporations have optionally chosen to adopt or adhere to, or say, okay, we can open the door a little more. But that's sort of the level we're at. I think it's an emerging conversation. For example, if you think about the definition of a social enterprise, that tends to vary depending on who you speak to. In my mind, it is fundamentally a for-profit business that has a social impact. So there must be an earned revenue component, or the business model must be such that some of the earnings go back into supporting the actual business. So that's how I define it. I think increasingly so it's being defined that way. But until recently, there wasn't even one definition around it, let alone a sort of global global construct or global convergence around it.
Are you finding that there's a preferred or a more effective way of interacting with social enterprises in terms of whether you interact directly or whether you interact within a broader framework? Because you spoke a moment ago about your partnerships with people like Ashoka or organizations like Ashoka. Is that a better framework, do you think, to make bigger partnerships and bring to the table a number of different players to be able to offer products to social enterprises as a big picture, as a broad plate, if you like, of offerings? Or is it better for Salesforce to engage directly with individual social enterprises at a one-on-one level?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. And just to round out the previous answer, I think it depends on the country. So the policies obviously vary by country, and some are more leading. Now, to answer this more recent question you asked, I definitely think there is a huge play for us to work with the intermediary. So those who are providing capacity or capital, because they have a strong understanding of their portfolio, what, enterprises are sort of suffering from or what challenges they face, what they've done well. They have strong relationships with the leadership at each of the enterprises. So I think that relationship absolutely should be strong. And from an efficiency perspective, if you think of us as a large corporation, we can't have boots on the ground everywhere. It's much easier for us to work with a credible and a trusted partner. So I think from that perspective, it's great. And there should be more sort of cross-pollination of ideas between intermediaries and whatnot. With that said, I'm going to actually, cheat and say both are important. There also needs to be a dedicated sort of cadre of people who are very much in touch with the social entrepreneurs themselves and who have that relationship and who've gone on the ground like myself, because the things I've seen and the stories I'm able to tell and what I can speak to is very different than what we will get from having a couple conversations with the intermediary. And I am the one inside the corporation who's positioned to help change the culture and to help sort of create a persuasive case about why we should work more with social enterprises. So both are important. It's more about what the portfolio or what the mix is around it, 80-20 or something else.
So give me a sense of one particular individual project or association or anything else that you're involved in that you think is really working and why it's working.
Yeah, so basically something I wasn't directly involved in, though, that I think is really working. The Oakland School District previously basically was using, Excel spreadsheets and other tools to gather information, to collect it, to track information. As I mentioned, I think the sort of the benefit of our product is this 360 view. And due to the pandemic, I think they were able to fast track their usage of our technology to really get a view of their students, their administrators, and figure out how they can go back to school in a more efficient and effective way. So from a company perspective, I'm very proud of that. I think what's really great about Salesforce is when these things happen, such as a pandemic or when there's a key challenge we're trying to crack, we can bring various assets to the table. I've been trying to restrict myself to .org, but there's that technology element, but there's also the philanthropic element. And when the philanthropic side meets the technology side, I think that's where a particular type of impact and magic happens. Now, if I look at sort of my space, just like, in more of a box or more of a silo, I would say that our sort of engagement with the COVID Alliance has been really important. I think we partnered with other corporations to put out this call to action where we're asking other corporations to join us in making a commitment to, social entrepreneurs or social enterprises at this sort of dire time. And I was a little hesitant to say that because you started the conversation by talking about PR and whatnot. But I think it's really the way that you frame it. I think any major social impact endeavor or innovation starts with commitment. We are making a public commitment by joining this alliance, and we're asking others to join us. So I think that engagement worked really well because that alliance is just not just corporations, it's corporations, impact investors, network social enterprises, all coming together and all understanding that this is a joint commitment we've made. You can check in with me in a year and see how that goes, but I'm sort of very proud of that from an organizational perspective as well.
We can check in with you in a year from now. But having said what we've said about the difference of jurisdictions and the difficulties of working in different countries and around the world, can you make a general comment about what are the biggest challenges that you do face in doing this kind of work, both on a personal level and an organizational international level? Well, where are the biggest obstacles to taking this approach to business?
That's a very good question. And the reason I paused before the question earlier where you asked me what I'm sort of proud about or what I'm most proud of that we've done or what has worked well is because I was thinking about some of these challenges. So, for example, there's a rise in domestic violence cases. So I've been speaking to a specific very good nonprofit in an Asian country about the usage of our technology. And I'm working on sort of the .org piece of it, but what they're really struggling with right now is just money to pay their staff. So if that falls through, then even if they have the technology, this is not going to work for them. And so although they do have they're a Salesforce user now, they have Salesforce technology in their hands, we're supporting them, but there's this huge financial gap. So I see, a couple months down the road, almost this failure, for lack of better words, in front of me, and I can't really do anything but try to sort of chase the capital side. And so how do we bring those two together in a more impactful way, I think is one of the most challenging things. And to be very frank with you, I think with certain communities in Asia and whatnot, we just don't have the knowledge. Sometimes we don't have the stories, not we being Salesforce, but I think at large, those sitting in the US or Europe or whatnot don't always have the right connections, the right stories to move quickly enough. And it takes so long for us to partner in a meaningful way, just because we don't have the same type of presence. So there's always a chicken and an egg phenomena. Do we get the technology into hands of people and then develop a presence, or do we develop the relationships and a presence and then sort of get the technology into the hands of the people? And I'm not speaking from a Salesforce perspective alone. I'm just talking at large at the industry level. I think there is a bit of like a challenge there, especially countries in Asia.
Well, tell me a little bit more about your Asia perspective. Obviously, you're not an Asia-based corporation, but you're very active in this part of the world. From the perspective of this conversation, what are your plans for Asia and social enterprise in this part of the world?
So I can't speak for plans as a company. What I can say is over the medium term, the market has done really well in Asia. So I think it's a promising space. I think we will only, increase our depth and the depth of our relationships, these relationships I spoke of from a social impact perspective. I only see greater and greater sort of promise there. Now, the only reason I hesitate in saying some of this is because there's obviously a global pandemic taking place. I cannot, just as much as probably you cannot, foresee how long it'll take for us to get back on the normal trajectory we were. But so far, so good. So I see, it only becoming increasingly important for both .org and .com and the broader industry to have a footprint and to work in Asia.
Let me just finish off then by asking you specifically about the relationship that a social enterprise can have with Salesforce from this end of the lens. How can a social enterprise here in Asia engage with your corporation? What is the best way to find out about the possibilities of engagement and the potential for some sort of relationship?
Well, somebody could reach out to me and I can connect the dots internally. That's one way. And what we offer to nonprofits in many ways can also be offered to a nonprofit social enterprise. So the Power of Us Hub program, which is our technology, that's available, and then pro bono support around it. So there are those avenues. And I would just say our offerings that are available to nonprofits, social enterprises should approach it as also available to them if they are a nonprofit. I think where it gets tricky is around the for-profit element. And as I mentioned earlier, that hasn't been figured out, not just by Salesforce, but I think the entire sort of ecosystem needs to do a better job of figuring that out. So certainly can contact me if there's a social enterprise on the ground. And then obviously we have a host of others internally, that I would then further connect, these enterprises with.
Certainly the whole ecosystem needs an awful lot more development and maturity and nuance built into it. But it's great to hear what work you guys are doing. And we've only managed to glimpse a little bit, I think, of the company philosophy and the company activity. But it's been really interesting to talk to you, Samira. Thanks very much indeed.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much for having me.